The man in the black SUV didn't stop for strangers. That was the rule. Had been the rule for 20 years, through 4 federal investigations, 2 wars with rival organizations, and more situations than Dante Viscari cared to count, where compassion had been the weapon someone tried to use against him. You didn't stop. You didn't slow down. You kept moving, and you stayed alive. He broke the rule for a necklace, not for the woman collapsed in the snow beside the dead truck on that frozen Montana highway, not out of mercy or instinct or any of the softer things men like him had spent decades cutting out of themselves. He stopped because through 40 yards of blizzard and darkness and blowing snow, he saw a flash of silver at her throat, a compass, small and worn, catching the headlights for exactly 1 second, and something he thought had been dead inside him for 22 years lurched back to the surface like a body rising from cold water. His sister had worn that necklace the last night he ever saw her. She was 8 years old, the house was burning, and she was gone before morning. If you've ever had something stolen from you that no amount of money or power could replace, drop the name of your city in the comments and stay with me. Because what happens next will remind you that some debts don't stay buried no matter how many years you pile on top of them. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. This story is just getting started. The storm hit without warning, not the kind that builds on a weather map, the kind you can track and prepare for. This one came down from the Canadian Rockies like something with a grudge, slamming into the Montana highway with 40-mile winds and zero visibility inside of 20 minutes. By the time Dante Viscari's convoy of 3 armored SUVs crested the ridge at 11,000 feet, the road ahead had disappeared beneath 3 feet of new snow, and the only thing keeping them on the mountain was the driver's memory of where the edge used to be. In the lead vehicle, Dante sat in the back seat behind tinted glass and didn't speak. He hadn't spoken in 2 hours. His men had learned not to fill that silence with anything that wasn't necessary. The meeting in Billings had gone the way meetings like that always went, with promises that meant nothing and handshakes that meant less. And Dante had come away from it with the particular kind of stillness that made his closest lieutenants check their phones and pretend to find something important there. Marco, riding shotgun, spotted it first. "Boss?" That was all he said. Dante looked up. Through the windshield and the curtain of snow, maybe 40 yards ahead, a figure was standing at the shoulder of the highway beside a dark pickup truck sitting at a dead angle, its rear end dropped into the ditch. The figure took 2 steps toward the road and then went down. Not stumbled. Went down. The way people go down when the body stops negotiating and just quits. "Keep moving," said the man seated to Dante's left. His name was Ricci, and he had been with Dante for 11 years. "Look at that setup. Abandoned vehicle. Somebody in the road. It's a pull stop." "In this weather," Dante said. Not really a question. "That's exactly when you run it. You know that." Dante knew that. He also knew that his convoy was armed enough to repel a small military unit, and that stopping was, by every standard of operational procedure he had built over 20 years, an obvious mistake. The truck could have been loaded with men. The woman, and he could see now that it was a woman, dark hair plastered across her face by the wind, could have been wearing body armor under that thin coat that made no sense at all for the temperature. He said, "Stop the convoy." Ricci said, "Dante, stop the convoy and stay in the vehicle." He was out the door before Ricci finished the sentence. Into wind cold enough to strip the air from your lungs on contact, boots punching through the snow crust as he walked toward her with his hand inside his coat and his eyes moving to the tree line on both sides of the road. Nothing moved. The trees were bent nearly horizontal, and the snow was coming sideways, and there was nothing out there except the storm. She was on her knees when he reached her, hands braced against the snow, head down. Her coat was a summer-weight canvas jacket, the kind a person might grab off a hook near the door without thinking. She had no hat, no gloves. Her hands were the color of old wax. Dante crouched beside her. "Hey." She lifted her face and looked at him, and her eyes were present. That was the first thing he registered. She wasn't unconscious. She was burning through the last of something, willpower or body heat or just the stubborn refusal to go down all the way, and she was losing that fight by degrees. "My truck," she started. "I can see your truck. Don't worry about your truck." He looked her over for what a trained eye looks for and found nothing that read as tactical. No earpiece, no tell of body armor at the shoulder line, hands too far gone for a clean weapon draw. Can you stand? I don't know. Honest answer. He gave her credit for that. He reached under her arm to help her up, and that's when her coat shifted and the necklace swung free of her collar and caught the light from the convoy's headlights 20 yards behind them. Dante Vescari had walked into burning buildings. He had stood at the graveside of people he'd loved and people he'd killed, and some he'd done both to. He had received news that rearranged the architecture of his entire life and absorbed it with a face that told nobody anything. The necklace stopped him the way nothing had stopped him in 22 years. It was a compass. Sterling silver, the rose engraved on the face worn smooth from handling, the 4 directional points still sharp, a small chip on the southwestern quarter where someone had dropped it on concrete once a long time ago. A chip he had been there for, a chip he could close his eyes and see clearly because it had happened on the kitchen floor of a house that no longer existed, in a life that had been taken from him before he was old enough to understand what it meant to lose something forever. He didn't move for a moment, just held the woman's arm while the wind hammered them both, and the snow filled in his footprints behind him almost as fast as he made them. That necklace, he said. Where did you get it? She was confused. What? The necklace. The compass. Where did you get it? She looked down at it, dangling from her neck in the wind, and something crossed her face that wasn't confusion, more like the specific unease of a person being asked about something they thought was entirely private. It was my mother's. I really need to get out of the cold. In a moment. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Your mother's name. What is that? Her name. Margaret Rowan. She was shaking now, real shaking, the deep muscular kind that means the body is working hard to save itself. She passed 3 years ago. She gave it to me. It was hers for as long as I can remember. She looked at him with eyes that were starting to lose focus at the edges, the way eyes do when the cold gets to a certain depth. I don't understand why you're asking me this. Dante stood up. He flagged his men forward without looking back, and when Marco jogged up beside him, he said, Get her in the vehicle and get the heat on her. Call Dr. Felice and have him ready when we arrive. Marco looked at the woman, then at Dante. We're bringing her to the estate? Yes. Dante, we don't know who she is. I know. He was already walking back toward the SUV. Bring her. That was how it started. Not with a plan or a calculation or the kind of strategic thinking that had kept Dante Vescari alive and free for 2 decades in an industry where most men were dead or imprisoned before 50. It started with a necklace and a chip on the southwestern quarter and a dead woman's name that told him almost nothing, and it started with the decision to stop the convoy on a blizzard-locked Montana highway, because something at the base of his spine told him that driving away from this particular stranger would be the worst mistake of what remained of his life. He was not wrong about that. He was just wrong about the direction. Her name was Elena Rowan. She told them this herself, sitting in the back of the lead SUV with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and a cup of coffee she held in both hands without drinking, more for the warmth against her palms than anything else. She was 34. She was a wildlife photographer, freelance, based out of Missoula, currently on assignment tracking gray wolf pack movement through the northern Rockies for a conservation foundation out of Portland. She had been 2 days into a solo backcountry route when the storm came in faster than the forecast, and she'd made it back to her truck before the worst of it. But the engine had seized 2 miles from the highway, and she'd walked the rest. She told them all of this in a flat, even voice, with her eyes moving around the interior of the vehicle and cataloging everything in it. The weapons cases behind the rear seat, the satellite phone in the center console, the way Marco and the other man in front kept their shoulders turned so they could see her in the peripheral. And she didn't ask who these people were or where they were taking her. She asked for water. She asked whether the coffee was fresh. She said thank you when Ricci handed her a dry pair of gloves from the emergency kit under the seat. She didn't ask about the compound when they arrived, though it wasn't the kind of place a person arrives at and doesn't register. Dante's mountain estate was built into a north-facing slope at 8,000 feet, accessible by a single road that the storm had made essentially impassable for anything not carrying a plow. The outer structure was stone and steel, designed to read from the air as a high-end hunting lodge, the kind of thing that belonged to a wealthy recluse with no interest in visitors. Inside was something else. Dr. Felice met them at the vehicle bay and took Elena immediately, and Dante let her go without following. He went directly to his study and stood at the window and looked at nothing. Ricci came in after 20 minutes. "She's not hypothermic. Close. Felice says she'll be fine by morning." He paused. "You want to tell me what happened back there on the road?" Dante turned from the window. He walked to the safe behind the east wall panel, opened it, and removed a photograph from the bottom of the inner compartment. Not the first stack, not anything he'd needed to reach for in the last several years, but something he knew exactly where to find because he had never moved it, never let himself forget where it was. He set it on the desk. It was an old photograph, a family photograph, taken on the back porch of a house in Western Virginia on a summer afternoon that Dante could still smell if he let himself. Charcoal smoke and cut grass and the particular soap their mother used on laundry. He was 12 in the photograph. Beside him, 8 years old, gap-toothed and squinting against the sun, was his sister Lucia. She was wearing the compass necklace. Ricci looked at the photograph for a long moment and then looked at Dante. That's not possible. And yet, the woman could have bought it, found it, stolen it. Her mother's necklace for as long as she can remember. Dante sat down. Lucia disappeared the night of the Whitmore Street fire. She was 8 years old. No body was ever recovered. The necklace was never found. Law enforcement, our own people, 15 independent contractors over 12 years, no trace. He looked at the photograph. That necklace was around my sister's neck the last time I saw her alive. Ricci was quiet for a moment. "So what do you want to do?" "Carefully," Dante said. "I want to find out everything there is to know about a woman named Elena Rowan. Her mother, her father, where she was born, where she grew up, every address she's ever listed, every photograph of her that exists before the age of 10. He looked at Ricci. "And I want that information before she wakes up tomorrow morning." What came back from Dante's people overnight was clean, too clean. Elena Rowan had a social security number, a Montana driver's license, 2 years of undergraduate work at the University of Montana before switching to photography, a portfolio that had been published in 3 conservation magazines, a 2019 Subaru registered in her name, a modest bank account, no criminal record, no civil judgments, and a rental apartment in Missoula that her landlord confirmed she had occupied for 4 years. She paid rent on time. She was quiet. She kept a cat. Before the age of 8, there was nothing. No birth record in any Montana county, no record of Margaret Rowan ever giving birth. The adoption, when Ricci's contact finally found it, was a sealed private adoption process through a now-defunct agency in rural Idaho in 1994. The paperwork was impeccable and told them nothing. Elena Rowan had been placed with Margaret Rowan as an infant, or that was what the paperwork said. Dante was still sitting at his desk when Elena appeared in the doorway of the study at 7 in the morning, wearing borrowed clothes that were too large for her and carrying her coffee mug. She looked better. The color had come back into her face, and the unfocused quality around her eyes was gone. She looked, in the gray morning light from the window, like a person who had slept well and woken up sharper than most people managed, and the way she stood in the doorway told him she'd already decided not to wait for an invitation. "I'd like my camera equipment back," she said. "If someone picked it up from the truck." "It's here. You can have it when we've talked." She came in and sat down across from him without being asked. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "You're going to tell me who you are?" "In time." "You know who I am." "Less than I'd like." She looked at him steadily. She had her mother's necklace back on. Dante's people had returned it with her other personal items on his instruction. She wasn't touching it, but he could tell she knew where it was. "You stopped your convoy on a highway in a blizzard because of this necklace." She touched it once, briefly. "That means it means something to you, which means you're going to explain that to me, and I'm going to decide what to do with the information." Dante looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the desk and set the photograph between them. Elena picked it up. She looked at it for a long time. The light coming through the window shifted as the clouds moved, and the photograph was briefly very bright and then dim again. And in that brightness, Dante watched her expression change. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories, but something subtle and specific moving behind her eyes, like a door in a room she didn't know she had, opening onto a staircase going somewhere underground. "The little girl," she said. "My sister, Lucia." He paused. "She was 8 when this was taken. 6 weeks later, our family home burned. Our parents died in the fire. Lucia was never found." Elena set the photograph down carefully. She was quiet for a moment. "And the necklace?" "She was wearing it that night." Elena looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the storm had finally quieted, and the mountains were buried under 3 feet of new snow, and the silence was total, the kind of silence that only exists above a certain altitude where the world runs out of things to say. "My mother gave it to me when I was 6, Elena said. "She told me it belonged to someone who loved me before she could." Her voice didn't change. She delivered it flat, like a fact she'd made peace with a long time ago. "I never knew what that meant. She died before I could ask her the right questions." Dante said nothing. "I don't know who you are," Elena said, "but I'm going to guess you have people who can run a DNA test. I already have a sample request drafted." For the first time since she'd walked in, something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, exactly. More the small, involuntary acknowledgement of one careful person recognizing another. "Then I suppose we wait," she said. They waited 4 days. The results came back from the lab on the 5th morning. Dante opened them alone in the study and read them twice before he called Ricci in. He handed the report across the desk without a word. Ricci read it. "No blood relation." He set the paper down. "Dante, she's not Lucia." "No." Dante stood at the window again with his coffee going cold in his hand. "She's not Lucia." He turned. But she was wearing Lucia's necklace, which means Lucia gave it away. Or someone who had access to Lucia gave it to Elena's adoptive mother. He set the mug down. "Which means my sister was alive long enough to do that." Ricci was quiet. "Lucia survived," Dante said. The words were flat and factual and cost him something that didn't show on his face. "She survived the fire, and she survived whatever came after it, at least long enough for that necklace to end up in the hands of Margaret Rowan in Idaho in 1994. He picked up the file again. "And someone very badly does not want us to know any of this." He was still talking when the alarm went. Not the perimeter alert, the interior one, the one that only activated when something had already breached the outer defenses and was inside the compound's secondary ring. Ricci had his weapon out before the sound finished. Dante was already moving toward the door when the first explosion hit the east wing, close enough to feel through the floor, and the lights went out, and in the sudden darkness the estate became something different. Not a refuge, not a fortress, but a trap that someone had been patient enough to let him walk into. Somewhere in the building behind him, Elena Rowan was awake, and from the sound of what came next, a cry, the crash of furniture, then nothing. Someone had come specifically for her. Dante ran. She could have it when they talked. Elena came in and sat down across from him without being asked. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "You're going to tell me who you are." "In time." "You know who I am." "Less than I'd like." She looked at him steadily. She had her mother's necklace back on. Dante's people had returned it with her other personal items, on his instruction. She wasn't touching it, but he could tell she knew exactly where it was. "You stopped your convoy on a highway in a blizzard because of this necklace." She touched it once, briefly. "That means it means something to you, which means you're going to explain that to me, and I'm going to decide what to do with the information." Dante looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the desk and set the photograph between them. Elena picked it up. She looked at it for a long time. The light from the window shifted as clouds moved, and the photograph was briefly very bright and then dim again, and in that brightness, Dante watched something subtle and specific move behind her eyes. like a door in a room she didn't know she had, opening onto a staircase going somewhere underground. "The little girl," she said. "My sister. Lucia." He paused. "She was 8 when this was taken. 6 weeks later, our family home burned. Our parents died in the fire. Lucia was never found." Elena set the photograph down carefully. "And the necklace?" "She was wearing it that night." Elena looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the storm had finally quieted and the mountains were buried under fresh snow, and the silence was the kind that only exists above a certain altitude where the world runs out of things to say. "My mother gave it to me when I was 6, Elena said. "She told me it belonged to someone who loved me before she could." Her voice didn't change, flat, like a fact she'd made peace with long ago. "She died before I could ask the right questions." Dante said nothing. "I don't know who you are," Elena said, "but I'm going to guess you have people who can run a DNA test." "I already have a sample request drafted." For the first time since she'd walked in, something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, more the involuntary acknowledgement of one careful person recognizing another. "Then I suppose we wait." They waited 4 days. The results came back on the 5th morning. Dante opened them alone and read them twice before calling Ricci in. He handed the report across the desk without a word. Ricci read it. "No blood relation." He set the paper down. "Dante, she's not Lucia." "No." Dante stood at the window with his coffee going cold. "She's not Lucia, but she was wearing Lucia's necklace, which means Lucia gave it away. Or someone who had access to Lucia gave it to Elena's adoptive mother." He set the mug down. "Which means my sister was alive long enough to do that." Ricci was quiet. "Lucia survived," Dante said. "She survived the fire and whatever came after it, at least long enough for that necklace to end up in the hands of Margaret Rowan in Idaho in 1994. He picked up the file. "And someone very badly does not want us to know any of this." He was still talking when the alarm went. Not the perimeter alert, the interior one, the one that only activated when something had already breached the outer defenses and was inside the compound's secondary ring. Ricci had his weapon out before the sound finished. Dante was already moving toward the door when the first explosion hit the east wing, close enough to feel through the floor, and the lights went out, and in the sudden darkness, the estate became something different. Not a refuge, not a fortress, but a trap someone had been patient enough to let him walk into. Somewhere in the building behind him, Elena Rowan was awake. And from the sound of what came next, a cry, the crash of furniture, then silence. Someone had come specifically for her. Dante ran. Git. The east corridor was black except for the emergency strips along the floor baseboards, thin red lines that turned the hallway into something that looked like the inside of a wound. Dante moved through it with his weapon drawn and his shoulder against the wall, Ricci 4 steps behind him, and ahead the sounds of the compound reorganizing itself around the breach. Boots on stone, shouts in the east wing, the specific sharp crack of a door being forced off its hinges somewhere above them on the 2nd floor. His men were moving. He could hear the coordination happening, the trained response of people who had run drills for exactly this scenario, and some part of him registered that this attack was clean, not panicked, not opportunistic. It had timing and structure, and it had come in through the one blind angle in the outer perimeter that his security chief had flagged for reinforcement 6 weeks ago and somehow never gotten around to. He filed that away and kept moving. Elena's room was at the end of the east corridor, ground floor, a decision Dante had made himself because it was furthest from the main entrance and closest to the vehicle bay. Easy extraction if necessary. He had told himself that was standard procedure. Standing in the red-lit corridor with his pulse at a controlled 110, he understood it had also made her the easiest target in the building for anyone who knew the layout. Someone knew the layout. He hit the door with his shoulder and came through it low, and the room was empty. Not just empty. The window on the far wall was open, the curtain blowing inward, and the small table beside the bed was on its side with the lamp on the floor. The coffee mug she'd carried everywhere was smashed against the baseboard. She hadn't gone quietly. He went to the window. Outside, a drop of maybe 6 feet to a snow-covered service path that ran along the back of the building toward the generator shed. The snow on the path was churned up, more than one set of prints. He counted 4 going toward the shed, and then something else. A gap in the pattern, a break in the stride length, the specific disruption in the track that meant someone had gone down and gotten back up. She'd fought. In the dark, outnumbered, and she'd fought. "They went for the shed," he said. Ricci was already on the radio, rerouting the exterior team. Dante went through the window. The cold hit him like a wall. The storm had dropped the temperature to something in the single digits overnight, and his breath came out in hard white bursts as he moved along the service path, following the track, weapon up, his feet punching through the snow crust with every step. Behind the generator shed, the path turned north toward the tree line, and in the darkness beneath the pines he could see movement. Figures, at least 3 of them, moving fast through the deep snow with a 4th between them that moved wrong, that moved with the specific irregular rhythm of someone being half-carried. He ran. He was closing the distance when the figure in the middle twisted hard to the left, breaking the grip of the man on her right arm, and drove her elbow back into the throat of the man behind her with a precision that dropped him straight into the snow. She was already moving, pivoting on her left foot, when the man on her left caught her around the waist, and she went down with him into a snowdrift, and there was a very brief and very violent few seconds, and then she was up, and he was not. Dante stopped 6 feet away with his weapon leveled at the third man, who had turned to face him with his own gun up, and for a moment nobody moved. The third man was dressed in tactical black, face obscured, and he was breathing hard, and he looked at Elena standing in the snow with blood on her lip and her borrowed clothes soaked through, and then he looked at Dante, and he made a calculation. He ran. Dante let him go. He had a face now, or enough of one, and there were cameras on the north tree line. He turned to Elena. She was standing with her weight forward, hands loose at her sides, and she was looking at the 2 men in the snow, the way you look at something you're trying to remember the details of. Not panicked, not shaking, cataloging. "You killed that man," Dante said. "He wasn't accusing, he was establishing facts. He was going to break my arm." She said it the way you say the ground is wet after rain. Then she looked at her own hands like they belonged to somebody else. "I don't—" She stopped, started again. "I don't know how I did that." That was the moment Dante understood they were dealing with something much larger than a necklace. Inside the compound, the attack was over in 11 minutes. 2 of Dante's men were injured, neither critically. 3 of the intruders were down, 1 dead, 2 incapacitated and zip-tied in the vehicle bay. The 4th had made the tree line and disappeared. And in the burned-out east wing, where the initial explosive had taken out a section of exterior wall, Ricci found something that changed the temperature of the room when he brought it to Dante. It was a photograph. Printed on heavy stock, the kind of quality that didn't come from a consumer printer. It showed Elena Rowan from the front, full body, standing outside what appeared to be her Missoula apartment building. It was dated 2 weeks prior, and across the bottom, handwritten in red marker in block letters, "Alive. Priority extract, do not terminate." Ricci set it on the desk. Dante looked at it for a long time. "They didn't come to kill her," Ricci said. "No. They came to take her." "Yes." Dante looked up. "Which means someone out there knows what she is before we do." Elena was in the doorway. She'd changed into dry clothes, her lip had been cleaned and butterfly taped by Dr. Feliz, and she was holding her coffee mug again. Someone had found her a new one, and she had clearly been standing there long enough to hear the last part of what Dante said. She walked in and looked at the photograph on the desk. Her own face stared back at her. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. "How long have I been watched?" she said. Not a question. "At least 2 weeks from this photograph. Likely longer." "Who are they?" "I don't know yet." Dante paused. "But they have resources. The breach tonight used exactly the right entry point, which means they had access to my security schematics. That is a very short list of people." Elena looked at him. "You have a leak." "Yes." "In this building." "Almost certainly." She absorbed this with a stillness that was starting to feel less like composure and more like something she'd been trained into. "And you're telling me this because Because you need to understand the situation you're in. He held her gaze. Whoever wants you alive wants you badly enough to breach a secured compound with a four-man team at 3 in the morning. And you have combat skills you can't account for and no memory of acquiring. He let that sit for a moment. That is not a coincidence. That is a profile. A profile of what? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. He picked up the photograph and set it face down. And until I do, you are not safe leaving this compound, and possibly not safe inside it. Something moved in her eyes. Not fear, something more like anger, the specific cold anger of a person who has just realized that the rules of their life have been changed without their consent. You're telling me I'm a prisoner. I'm telling you you're a target. The difference matters. He sat down. You can leave if you choose. I won't stop you. But the people who came tonight will find you inside of 48 hours without my resources between you and them. And the next team they send may have different instructions. Elena stood there for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, set her mug on the desk, and said, All right, tell me what you know, and I'll tell you what I know, and we'll figure out what we're missing. It took the better part of the day. Dante put everything on the table that he could afford to, which was not everything but was enough. The fire at Whitmore Street, his sister's disappearance, the years of investigation that produced nothing, the necklace, and what it meant. Elena listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both about timing. When he finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling and then looked at him. My mother, she said slowly. Margaret. She didn't talk about her past, at all. I thought it was just her nature. Private person. She paused. But there were things. Small things that I filed away and never went back to look at. She was working through it in real time, and Dante let her. She moved 4 times before I turned 10. Always rural, always cash. She didn't own a cell phone until I was in high school. She paid for everything with money orders. She looked at him. I thought she was just eccentric. She was hiding, Dante said. Yes. Elena's voice was flat again. She was hiding. With me. She touched the necklace without seeming to realize she was doing it, which means she knew. Whatever your sister knew, whatever this necklace is connected to, Margaret knew it too. And she spent my entire childhood running from it. And never told you. She told me it belonged to someone who loved me before she could. That was all. Her jaw was tight. She died of a stroke. Fast. No warning, no goodbye. If she had anything to tell me, it went with her. They sat with that for a moment. Ricci knocked and came in without waiting. He had a tablet in his hand and his face had the controlled blankness that meant the news was bad. He set the tablet on the desk between them and Dante looked at it. It was a personnel file. One of Dante's own men, 3rd-tier security, assigned to the outer perimeter rotation. Hired 14 months ago with references that had apparently been good enough, and a background that had apparently been clean enough, and a salary that had apparently not been enough. Because the transaction records Ricci's contact had just pulled showed 6 deposits into an offshore account over the last 8 months totaling just over $200,000. The last deposit had been made 36 hours ago. Bianchi, Dante said. He's gone, Ricci said. Slipped the rotation at some point during the attack. We didn't clock it until the head count came up short. Dante looked at the transaction records. 8 months. Whoever had been building toward tonight's operation had planted Bianchi 8 months ago, which meant they had been watching Elena Rowan and working toward this moment for at least that long, possibly longer, possibly from before Elena ever stumbled onto that highway. The highway, Dante said. Ricci looked at him. Her truck, the seized engine. Dante looked at Elena. You said you walked 2 miles from the truck to the highway. Yes. In those conditions. At night. In a coat that wasn't adequate. He paused. You're a backcountry photographer. You've been doing solo winter routes for how long? 6 years? And you went out in those conditions without adequate gear. Elena's face had changed. I had the right gear. It was in my pack. I left the pack in the truck when the engine... She stopped. Her hand came up slowly to the back of her neck, not touching anything, just the gesture of someone mentally retracing steps. The engine seized. I got out to look at it, and I had my pack. I remember reaching back for it. She was very still. I don't remember what happened between reaching for it and being on the highway. There's a gap, Dante said. There's a gap, she said, quietly, like she was hearing something collapse inside herself. The truck breaking down in that specific location, Dante said, in that specific storm. On the one highway my convoy uses coming out of Billings. He looked at Ricci. I want that truck. I want our people to go over every inch of it. It's buried under 3 feet of snow on a closed highway. Then unbury it. Ricci left. Elena was looking at the desk's surface, and Dante let her look, because she needed a moment and he understood that. She was rebuilding something, not her composure. She hadn't lost that. But her picture of the last few days, the last few years, possibly longer, and finding that the revised version looked nothing like what she'd believed it was. You think it was staged, she said finally. My truck, being on that highway. I think it's possible. Which means someone wanted you to find me. Or wanted to see what I would do when I found you. He watched her face. Or both. That's a very elaborate play, she said, to put someone in the path of a blizzard and hope the right person stops. Not hope. No. He leaned forward slightly. My convoy route out of Billings is not public information. My schedule is not public information. But someone who had access to my security schematics and could plant a man inside my compound for 8 months. He let the sentence finish itself. Elena sat with that. Then she reached across the desk and picked up the photograph. Her own face, alive, priority extract. And she looked at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, not anger. Something older. Something that looked almost like recognition. When I was 11, she said, I had a dream. Same dream, 3 nights running. I was in a room somewhere, concrete walls, no windows, and a man I didn't know was teaching me something. I couldn't see what. But I remember the feeling of it, the feeling of being very small and learning something that my body already knew. She set the photograph down. I told Margaret about it. She went pale. She told me it was just a dream, and I should forget it. Dante said nothing. I forgot it, Elena said, until about 40 seconds ago, watching my hands put a man in the snow and not knowing how they knew what to do. She looked at him. What did someone do to me, and when, and why does it connect to your sister? Those were exactly the right questions. Dante was about to say so when the satellite phone on the desk rang. The encrypted line, the one whose number existed in 4 places in the world, and one of those places had been inside this compound with Bianchi, and he looked at it for 1 ring, 2 rings, then picked it up. He didn't speak. He waited. The voice on the other end was male, processed through a modulator, and it said 7 words with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been waiting a long time to say them. She is not who you think she is. Then the line went dead. Dante set the phone down. He looked at Elena. She had heard it. The phone had been close enough on the desk, and her face was still, absolutely still, in the way that faces go still when the mind is moving faster than the body can catch up to. Who has that number? She said. 4 people. He picked the phone up again and looked at it like it might say something else. One of them is dead. One of them is in a federal holding facility with no outside communication. One of them is Ricci. He set it down. And one of them was my sister. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Elena reached up and closed her hand around the compass necklace, not pulling it, just holding it, and Dante watched her do it and understood that whatever came next was going to break the shape of everything they thought they were dealing with into something neither of them was prepared for. Outside, Ricci's voice came through the compound radio, clipped and tight. Dante, you need to come to the vehicle bay. We found something in Bianchi's locker. What? A burner phone. There are texts on it going back 4 months. A pause. The kind of pause that people take when they're deciding how to say something. the contact on the other end. Whoever was running Bianchi. Another pause. They have a name in the phone, a code name. Ricci's voice came through flat and careful. They call the contact Compass. Dante's hand tightened on the radio. Across the desk, Elena had gone completely still. Compass. The necklace around her throat. The encrypted call from a number only 4 people had. The combat skills that lived in her hands without living in her memory. The staged highway, the staged storm. The elaborate machinery of a plan that had been running for months or years before either of them had any idea it existed. Someone had built all of this. Had built it carefully and patiently and from a long way away. And they had chosen that name deliberately. Chosen it for an audience of exactly one person. The one person in the world who would understand what it meant the moment he heard it. Dante looked at Elena. Elena looked at Dante. "Your sister isn't just alive," Elena said. Her voice was quiet and level and certain in the way that things become certain once they can't be taken back. "She's been running this. All of it. She put me on that highway. She wanted you to find me." Her hand was still around the necklace. "The question is why?" Dante stood up. He picked up his weapon from the desk and checked the chamber with the automatic efficiency of a man who had been doing it for 30 years, and he said the only honest thing he had left to say. "Then we're going to have to find her before whoever is hunting her does. Because somewhere out there, 22 years of silence was about to end, and the truth it had been protecting was something powerful enough that people were still dying to keep it." But the burner phone had 14 weeks of text history, and it read like a field manual written in pieces. Ricci had it laid out on the workbench in the vehicle bay when Dante arrived, the screen scrolling through message after message in the cold fluorescent light, and the 2 incapacitated men from the attack were zip-tied to a support column 10 feet away, watching with the particular careful stillness of people who understood their situation completely. Elena stood at Dante's left shoulder and read without speaking. The messages were terse, operational, stripped of anything that could identify sender or recipient beyond the code name at the top of the contact thread. Compass. The earliest message was dated 4 months and 3 days ago. It said, "Asset confirmed in Missoula. Maintain distance. Do not engage until the package is in position." The package. Dante read that twice. He looked at Elena. She was already looking at him. "The package is you," she said. Not a question. "Or the necklace," he said. "Or both." He scrolled forward. The messages tracked movement. Elena's movement, her backcountry routes, her assignment schedule, her truck's maintenance history, including an entry that made his jaw tighten. Engine intervention completed. Timeline confirmed. Her truck hadn't seized. It had been made to seize. At a specific location, on a specific night, timed to the hour his convoy would pass. Elena read that entry and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "How long was I being followed before I knew there was anything to follow?" "Based on this, at least 4 months of active surveillance, probably longer of passive. And whoever is running this Compass, they knew your route. They knew everything." Dante set the phone down. "My route, my security layout, the right man to plant inside my operation, the right window to use. This wasn't assembled quickly." He looked at the 2 men zip-tied to the column, "which means someone with deep resources and a very long memory has been engineering this from the beginning." He walked to the 2 men. He stood in front of the closer one, late 30s, compact build, a professional's controlled breathing even now, and crouched down to eye level. "Who sent you?" Dante said. The man looked at him and said nothing. "The codename Compass. You know it." Nothing. "You came here to take her alive. That means she has value to someone. I want to know who." The man held his gaze and held his silence, and Dante read in that silence not defiance, but something more expensive. The specific blankness of a person who is more afraid of what's behind them than what's in front of them. That told him something. That told him that whoever had sent these men operated on a scale that made Dante Viscari look like a local problem. He stood up and turned to Ricci. "Get what you can. Be persuasive." He picked up the burner phone and walked back toward the main building with Elena beside him. Behind them, one of the men started talking before they reached the corridor door. It took 40 minutes. What Ricci brought back was partial, fragmented, and enough to make the room feel smaller. The two men were contractors. Private military background, no organizational loyalty, hired through a cutout 3 weeks prior. They knew two things of value. First, the operation had a name, Heliograph. Second, their handler, the person who had briefed them, paid them, and given them the estate's layout, had met them once, in person, in a parking garage in Denver, and had been a woman with a small scar at the left temple. A woman who had looked, the more talkative of the two, said, with the particular confusion of a man repeating something that unsettled him, like someone who had been somewhere very cold for a very long time. Dante sat with that. Ricci said carefully, "The scar placement." "I know where it is," Dante said. When Lucia was 6, she had fallen from the back fence of their Virginia yard and caught the corner of the concrete birdbath on the way down. 3 stitches. Left temple. Their mother had cried harder than Lucia had. Dante stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his hands at his sides and his breathing deliberate and even. And the mountain outside was white and still and told him nothing he didn't already know. His sister was alive. His sister had been alive for 22 years. His sister had built something called Heliograph, and she had planted a man inside his compound, and she had engineered Elena's appearance on that highway, and she had called his encrypted line to deliver 7 words in a modulated voice that he now understood was not concealment. It was announcement. She had wanted him to know it was her. She had wanted him exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing. He turned back to the room. "We're going to the observatory," he said. Ricci looked up. "Dante, if she wanted us to..." "I know." His voice was flat. "She's running us. She has been from the start. But whatever she buried under that observatory is the reason people are still dying 22 years later. And it's the reason someone wants Elena badly enough to breach this compound. And I am not going to find my sister by standing still." He looked at Elena. "You don't have to come." Elena picked up her coffee mug, took a long drink, and set it down. "You need someone who can identify what we're looking at when we find it," she said. "I spent 6 years photographing the backcountry. I know every abandoned installation in the northern Rockies by sight." "That's a convenient skill set." "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes. "It is. You can wonder about that, or you can use it." He used it. They left the compound 4 hours later, before dawn, in a single unmarked vehicle with Ricci driving and 2 men in a follow car a quarter-mile behind. Dante had spent the intervening hours doing 2 things: burning every non-essential document in the estate's secondary archive and running a full audit of every personnel file going back 30 months to find the seams in his organization that he hadn't known were there. He found 3. He made 3 phone calls. He didn't explain the calls to anyone, including Ricci. Trust had become a precision instrument. He could only afford to point it at one thing at a time. The abandoned military observatory sat at 9,000 feet on a granite shelf above the tree line, accessible by a fire road that the state had decommissioned in 2003 and that hadn't seen maintenance since. In the summer, it was a 4-wheel drive track through loose shale and switchbacks. In February, with 3 feet of new snow on top of 6 weeks of packed ice, it was something that required a different kind of attention, and Ricci drove it with both hands and no conversation, and Dante sat in the back with Elena and watched the tree line and thought about his sister. He thought about her at 8 years old, the gap in her teeth, the way she used to argue about everything. Not to win, but because she was genuinely interested in the structure of disagreement, in finding where 2 positions stopped overlapping. Their father had called it her lawyer's brain. Dante had called it exhausting. He had not known it would become the thing he missed most about her, that specific quality of her attention, the way she made you feel that your position was worth the trouble of dismantling. She had used that brain on him. She had built something 22 years in the making, and she had used the one thing she knew would stop his convoy in a blizzard, her own necklace around a stranger's throat. And she had run him like an asset, and he had not seen it until the phone rang. He didn't know yet whether to call that a betrayal. He needed more information before he could decide what it was. The observatory building appeared out of the dark and the snow at 4:47 in the morning, a low concrete structure, dome removed years ago, the mountings for it still standing like a crown of rusted bolts against the sky. The surrounding area was clear of fresh tracks. Whatever this place held, no one had been here recently, or they had been here and were very good at leaving no trace. Elena was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped and walking the perimeter of the structure with her hands in her pockets and her eyes moving across every surface. And Dante watched her do it and thought again about a woman in a concrete room learning things her body already knew. "Here," she said. She was standing at the north face of the building, at a section of wall that looked identical to every other section, and she was looking at the ground in front of it. "The snow's different here. Slightly lower, like something below is drawing heat." Dante looked. She was right. A depression in the snow, subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. "There's something underneath," he said. "There's a space underneath." She looked at him. "How did you know to come here?" "My investigator found a reference to it in archived federal records 12 years ago. A footnote in a decommissioning document. This facility had a secondary purpose that wasn't in the public filing. A sublevel installation, never publicly acknowledged, sealed in 1998. He paused. "I could never access what was in it." "What changed?" "You." He looked at the necklace at her throat. "The necklace is a compass. Lucia sent it to your mother for a reason. And before she called my line last night, she sent something else." He took out his phone and showed Elena the image that had arrived on his personal device at 3:22 that morning, 40 minutes after the encrypted call. A set of coordinates and a 9-digit alphanumeric sequence that he had recognized immediately as a lock code format used by military installations built before 1995. Elena looked at it, then she looked at the wall. The access panel was behind a false seam in the concrete, invisible unless you knew the exact pressure point. Elena found it in 4 minutes. The lock took the code. The door, when it finally released, exhaled a breath of cold, stale air that smelled of paper and metal, and something chemical and old, and beyond it a staircase went down into dark. They went down. The sublevel was a single long room, maybe 60 feet by 20, with metal shelving along both walls and a central table bolted to the floor. It had been a working space once. There were chair marks on the concrete, old coffee rings on the table surface, the ghost of a life that had operated here in secret for some period and then been sealed away. The shelves held archive boxes, uniform and labeled in a precise hand, and a bank of filing cabinets along the far wall, and on the table itself, left deliberately. The deliberateness of it was unmistakable. A single manila folder with nothing written on the outside. Dante picked it up and opened it. Inside were photocopies. 12 pages of them, dense with text and numbers and 2 photographs. He read the first page and his face didn't change. He read the second, and something in his chest did something he didn't have a name for. By the 4th page, Ricci had moved to read over his shoulder and had gone very quiet. Elena said, "Tell me." Dante set the folder on the table and pressed both palms flat against the surface and looked at nothing for a moment. "The Whitmore Street fire," he said. "It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a rival family." He paused. "It was a federal operation, a covert action run by a joint task force, intelligence and organized crime division, targeting 6 families simultaneously across 4 states. The Vescaris were one of them." He stopped. The goal was not arrest. The goal was elimination, full asset termination. Elena was very still. "They killed your family." "My parents and 3 other families, yes, but the children..." He looked at the folder. "The children were not to be terminated. The children were to be relocated and conditioned, placed with approved handlers and rebuilt from the ground up." He looked up. "Because the children were not the targets. The children were the asset." "What does that mean?" "It means we were raised in criminal organizations by parents who had documented knowledge of the network's operations, financial systems, communication channels, personnel, holdings. Information that would take a federal investigation decades to reconstruct from outside." He picked up the folder again. "They didn't want to prosecute the network. They wanted to inherit it. And the fastest way to do that was to take the children of the people who ran it. People who had grown up inside the infrastructure, people who knew where everything was buried, and spend a decade conditioning them to work for the other side. The room was very quiet. "How many children?" Elena said. 11, across 6 families. He turned to the photographs. The first was a surveillance image, grainy, showing a building he didn't recognize. The second was a group photograph, 7 children in a room, young, sitting at a long table, and the photograph had the flat, affectless quality of documentation rather than memory. He looked at the faces. He found his sister in the second row. He found 2 seats to her left, a dark-haired girl of perhaps 6 or 7 who looked directly into the camera with an expression of complete composed attention. He turned the photograph and held it up so Elena could see it. Elena looked at it for a long time. "I don't remember that photograph being taken," she said. "You're in it." "I know I'm in it." Her voice was very controlled. "I'm telling you, I don't remember it. I don't remember that room, or that table, or those children." She looked at him. "Which means someone took that memory from me." "Someone took it from all of you." Dante set the photograph down. "Elena, you are not Margaret Rowan's adopted daughter from a private Idaho agency. You are the daughter of a federal investigator named Thomas Kane, who worked the original operation and then defected from it when he understood what was actually being done to the children. He removed you from the program. He removed you, and he removed Lucia, and he placed you both with separate civilian handlers, and he fabricated identities clean enough to hold." He paused. "He was killed in 1999. Single vehicle accident on a Colorado highway that the official record lists as unrelated to any investigation." Elena sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. She just sat down, the way a person does when standing stops making structural sense. She sat with her back against the shelving and her knees up and her hands loose in her lap, and she looked at the wall across from her. Dante let her sit. After a while she said, "My whole life." "Yes. Everything I think I know about who I am." "Most of it, yes." "Lucia knew this. She's known this the whole time." "It appears so. And she set this up. She sent me to you. She wanted you to find the archive, to find me, to find all of this." Elena's head came up. "Why now? Why not 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Why build toward this specific moment?" Dante had been asking himself the same question since the phone call, and he had an answer he didn't like. He reached back into the archive box nearest to him, the one that had been sitting slightly forward from the others, recently handled, and removed the second folder inside it. This one had writing on the outside. 3 words in the same precise hand that had labeled every box in the room. It said, "They found us." He opened it. Inside was a single printed page, a surveillance photograph, high resolution, showing a building entrance in what looked like Washington, D.C. And walking through that entrance, in a dark coat, caught in a moment of perfect clarity by whatever camera had taken the shot, was a man in his early 70s with a bearing that suggested military background and the kind of face that suggested long practice at looking like nobody important. Ricci recognized him first. "That's Senator Hargrove." Dante knew the name. Most people in his world did, though for different reasons than most people in the civilian world did. Marcus Hargrove had been a senator from Wyoming for 23 years and a fixture of the Federal Intelligence Oversight Committee for 16 of those years, and a man whom nobody with working operational knowledge ever mentioned in the same breath as any specific allegation, because the specific allegations had a way of losing their witnesses before they reached any kind of formal proceeding. "He's one of the architects," Dante said. He was reading the page now. "He's been running the network since the original operation. He's the reason the investigation never progressed. He's the reason Thomas Kane died on a Colorado highway." He turned the page over. On the back, in Lucia's hand, 3 more words. "He comes Tuesday." Dante looked at the date stamp on the photograph. It had been printed 6 days ago. Tuesday was tomorrow. "Comes where?" Ricci said. Dante looked at the archive room around him. The boxes, the files, the evidence of decades of buried operations, the table with the chair marks and the coffee rings, and understood that his sister had not just led him here to show him the truth. She had led him here because this room was a staging point, because Lucia had built towards something that required this specific evidence, this specific night, and his specific presence. He was reaching for the next folder when his satellite phone went. He picked up. Lucia's voice came through without a modulator this time, clear and low and adult, and nothing like the 8-year-old voice he'd been hearing in his memory for 22 years, but with a cadence underneath it, a rhythm to the words, a particular way of landing on consonants that was unmistakably, irreducibly his. "You found the room," she said. "Yes." "You found Elena." "She's here." A pause. "Is she all right?" "She's sitting on the floor processing the fact that her entire life was a federal construction. She's managing." He looked at Elena, who was listening. "Where are you?" "Close. I've been close for 2 days." Another pause, shorter. "Dante, I need you to listen to me carefully because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you want to come find me, and I need you to not do that yet. Not yet. Do you understand?" "No." "I know. Listen anyway." He could hear her breathing, and he focused on that, on the physical reality of it, 22 years of absence compressed into the sound of his sister's lungs working. "Hargrove doesn't know about this room yet, but he knows about you. He's known since the moment your convoy stopped on that highway. Someone in his network flagged it, and he's going to move tonight, not tomorrow, tonight." "Move on what?" "On you, on Elena, on everything that connects you both to what's in that room." Her voice stayed level. "He has a federal warrant ready. Not a real one, a constructed one, the kind his people have been building for 6 months on the assumption that if you ever got close to the truth, he'd need to bury you under a prosecution instead of a highway." A pause. "Dante, the warrant names you for the Billings meeting. Someone in that room was wired." Dante didn't move. "The man you met with in Billings," Lucia said. "Carver. He's been Hargrove's asset for 3 years. The whole meeting was a setup. Everything said in that room is in federal hands, and it's being shaped right now into a package that puts you inside a cell for the rest of your life." She paused. "I'm sorry. I didn't know about Carver until 48 hours ago. If I had—" "Stop," Dante said. His voice was very quiet and very even, and somewhere under it something was on fire. "If you had known, if you had given me any of this before you ran me straight into a federal sting." "I know. You used me." Silence on the line. "You used me," he said again, not louder. "You built this whole operation, Elena, the highway, the compound breach, all of it. You ran me like an asset, and you did not tell me that the man I was meeting in Billings was going to hand me to the people who killed our parents. I told you I'm sorry. I don't want sorry. I want to understand when you decided that I was a piece on your board instead of your brother." The silence this time was longer. When Lucia spoke again, her voice had something in it that he didn't have a name for yet. Not guilt exactly, not regret exactly, something that lived below both of those. "When I was 8 years old," she said, "and the house was burning, I ran back for you. Do you remember that?" He didn't answer. "I came back through the smoke for you, and someone stopped me, a man I didn't know. He pulled me out, and he told me you were already clear, and I believed him because I was 8 and the house was burning, and I believed him." Her breath came through the line, rough and uneven. "You were not already clear. He lied to me to get me out. And I have spent 22 years trying to figure out whether the thing I built was for the truth or whether it was so I could look at you and know that someone got out, even if I missed my chance to be the one who saved you." The room was very quiet. "Lucia," he said. "I'm almost done," she said. "Just let me finish." She steadied herself. "There is a vault under the old railway station at Corvette Pass, 30 miles north of where you are. It has everything. The complete record, financial ledgers, personnel files, the communications archive. Enough to end Hargrove and everyone connected to him. Elena has the access key. She's carried it since she was 6 without knowing what it was." Dante looked at Elena. Elena looked at the necklace in her hand. "The compass," Elena said. Not to Dante. To the room. "The compass," Lucia confirmed through the phone, and her voice when she said it had the quality of something finally being set down after a very long carry. "Thomas Kane built it into the casing before he placed her. He knew if anything happened to him, the key needed to be somewhere Hargrove's people would never think to look." "He's in a necklace around a child's throat," Elena said. In the one place that had to keep moving, Lucia said, in the one person nobody was looking for. Dante closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then he opened them, and he was done with the feeling part of it, and he was in the part that came after feeling, the part he was built for. "How much time?" he said. "Hargrove's people are 2 hours out, maybe less." "And you?" "I'll meet you at Corvette Pass." A pause. "Dante, I'm sorry I used you. I do it again. I need you to know both of those things are true at the same time." He said, "I know." And he meant it, which was the most complicated thing he had felt in 22 years. "Don't be late." He ended the call and looked at Ricci, and then at Elena, who had gotten up off the floor and was standing with the compass necklace in her open palm, looking at it with the expression of someone reading a map they've been carrying without knowing it. "It's a key," she said. "Yes." "My whole life," she said again, but differently this time. Not broken, more like a person picking up a tool they didn't know they were holding. "We need to move," Dante said. He looked at the archive room. The boxes, the folders, the evidence his sister had spent 22 years assembling, and made the calculation. They couldn't take it all. They could take the 2 folders. And they could take Elena. Because Elena carried the only thing that opened what was waiting at Corvette Pass, and Hargrove's people were 2 hours out, and somewhere in the 30 miles of mountain dark between here and the railway station, a woman who had been 8 years old the last time Dante saw her was already moving. He took one last look at the group photograph on the table, his sister in the second row, Elena 2 seats left, 7 children sitting at a table in a concrete room learning to become something none of them had chosen. Then he went up the stairs and into the cold and didn't look back. The fire road down from the observatory was worse than the climb up. Ricci drove it with the headlights off for the first mile, navigating by the pale reflection of snow against granite. And nobody spoke because there was nothing to say that would help, and every second of noise was a second of not listening to the dark outside the vehicle. Dante sat in the back with the 2 folders on his lap and his weapon across his thigh and his eyes on the side mirror. Elena sat beside him with the compass in her closed fist, not looking at anything in particular, doing the internal work that people do when the ground under their entire history has just shifted and they have to decide what to stand on instead. The follow car stayed a quarter-mile back. Ricci had radioed them once on the encrypted channel and gotten a clean response. That was something. At the base of the fire road, Ricci stopped and killed the engine, and they sat in the dark and listened for 90 seconds. Wind, timber moving, nothing mechanical. 2 hours, she said, Ricci said quietly. That was 20 minutes ago, Dante said, and Lucia's estimates have been conservative tonight. Meaning we have less. Meaning we move. Ricci started the engine and pulled onto the state road heading north and got the vehicle up to speed and kept it there. The road was plowed but iced over, and the headlights made a tunnel of white in the dark, and Dante watched the tunnel and thought about a railway station 30 miles ahead and what was underneath it, and the woman who had built a 22-year plan around getting him to this specific road on this specific night. He thought about being 12 years old on a back porch in Virginia with the smell of charcoal smoke in the air and his sister squinting against the sun. He put that away. He would take it out again later, or he wouldn't. Either way, it didn't belong in the next 2 hours. The warrant, Elena said. She was looking at the road ahead. If Hargrove has a federal warrant ready to deploy, it means he has federal infrastructure moving with his people tonight, Dante said. Not just contractors, actual agents who believe they're executing a legitimate operation. Against you. Against me and anyone found with me. He looked at her. You understand what that means. It means I'm not just a target for extraction anymore. I'm collateral on a federal action. She said it the way she said most things. Flat, direct, no wasted syllables. Which means Hargrove gets to bury everything in that vault under a prosecution that makes us look like the criminals and him look like the oversight. That's the architecture, yes. So we need the vault open and the contents out before his people arrive. Yes. And your sister is 30 miles ahead of us in the dark, with a head start she's spent 22 years building. Elena turned to look at him. Do you trust her? The question sat between them for a moment, Dante thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I trust that she wants Hargrove destroyed, he said. I trust that she has spent longer building toward that than anyone else alive. I trust the part of her that came back through a burning house for me when she was 8 years old. He paused. Whether those things and trust are the same thing, I genuinely don't know yet. Elena nodded slowly. She opened her hand and looked at the compass. My father built this key and died for it. Your sister spent 22 years in the cold for it. Margaret Rowan spent my entire childhood running from people who wanted it. She closed her hand again. Whatever's in that vault has to be worth all of that. It has to be, Dante said, or none of it means anything. They drove. Corvette Pass announced itself as a geographic narrowing, the mountains pressing in on both sides of the highway, the road rising slightly, the tree coverage thickening. The railway station sat a quarter-mile off the main road on a spur that had served a now-defunct mining operation, and the station itself was the kind of structure that had been left to the weather and the decades without ceremony or acknowledgement. A long, low building of brick and timber, the platform still visible under the snow, the track buried, the signage long stripped. In the darkness, it was a shadow with a shape, nothing more. Ricci turned onto the spur road, and the vehicle ground through deep, unplowed snow, and the headlights swept across the station facade, and Dante saw the vehicle before he saw anything else. A dark sedan parked tight against the north wall. No plates visible. Engine off. No breath from the exhaust pipe, which meant it had been there long enough to go cold. Stop here, Dante said. Ricci stopped. The follow car halted 50 yards behind. They sat and looked at the sedan. It told them two things. Someone had arrived before them, and they had arrived before Hargrove's people, because Hargrove's people would not be traveling in a single unmarked sedan. They would be traveling in the organized way that federal operations travel, with the infrastructure of institutional violence, multiple vehicles, communications, a perimeter. The sedan meant Lucia, or it meant something else. Dante got out. The cold at this elevation and this hour was a different order than the cold at the compound. Drier, thinner, the kind that made the inside of your nose ache with the first breath. He moved toward the station with his weapon out and Ricci flanking him 8 feet to the left, and Elena behind and slightly right, and she moved well. He noticed that again, the economy of it, the way she placed her feet and managed her sightlines without being told. The station's main door was unlocked, pushed open from the inside recently. The drift that had built against it was broken and scattered. Inside was the smell of old wood and cold and disuse, and in the far corner where a ticket counter had once stood, a flashlight sat on the floor pointing upward, and in the cone of light it threw, sitting on a wooden bench with her coat pulled close, and her hands visible, and a cup of something that was steaming slightly despite everything, was his sister. She was 54 years old, and she looked it, but she looked it the way people look their age when they've spent it doing something instead of enduring it. She had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and a scar at her left temple that was small and silver in the flashlight beam, and she looked at Dante when he came through the door with an expression he'd had no way to prepare for. The specific, helpless relief of a person who has been waiting for something for so long that the arrival of it is almost unbearable. She didn't stand. She waited. Dante crossed the room and stopped 3 feet from her, and they looked at each other for a moment that had 22 years of weight behind it and no adequate language in front of it. You're shorter than I remembered, he said. Something happened to her face. Not a smile. Larger than a smile. You're older than you should be, she said. I'm sorry for that. We'll settle it later. He sat down on the bench beside her because standing felt like a performance. He sat, and she sat, and their shoulders were 6 inches apart, and he felt the reality of her, the physical fact of her breath and her warmth, and he felt it the way you feel a thing you stopped believing in. Elena came in, and Lucia looked at her with something that was complicated and private, and Elena looked back, and after a moment Elena said, You put me on that highway in a blizzard. I put you on that highway, Lucia said, so the one person with the resources to protect you would have to stop. She paused. I'm sorry for the blizzard. The timing was genuine. You conditioned me, Elena said. Her voice didn't rise, it just got more precise. You were part of what happened to those children in that room. I was a child in that room with you, Lucia said, and then I grew up inside the program, and I learned everything it could teach me, and I turned it inside out from the center. That is the only thing I can offer you. It isn't enough. I know that. Elena stood with that for a long moment. Then she opened her hand and showed Lucia the compass. Show me where. The access point was under the station floor, beneath a section of platform decking that looked solid from above and lifted clean on a pneumatic mechanism that Lucia activated from a panel behind the old ticket counter. Below it, stairs. Below the stairs, a corridor of poured concrete that extended south, away from the building, and at the end of the corridor a vault door of the kind that belonged in a different century. Heavy steel, combination, and key both. The key poured a compass-shaped depression that Lucia had to show Elena twice before the angle was right. The necklace's central mechanism detached from the casing with a specific pressure at the southwestern chip, the same chip Dante had recognized in the blizzard, and the internal component that slid free was not decorative. It was a precision-machined key that Thomas Kane had embedded in a piece of jewelry 30 years ago and trusted to survive everything that came after him. It survived. Elena fit it to the port. The door opened. What was inside was not dramatic to look at. It never is. Rows of archive boxes, a bank of hard drives racked and powered by a battery backup that had been running for years, a sealed document case marked with a string of reference numbers, and a server unit with a satellite uplink that Lucia had installed herself during one of 4 visits to this location over the past decade. The uplink, Dante said. Ready? Lucia said. Everything on those drives mirrors to 12 separate international servers the moment I initiate the sequence. The document case goes to 6 simultaneous press contacts and 3 foreign government channels. She paused. Once I start it, it can't be stopped. Not by Hargrove, not by anyone. The information leaves this room and it doesn't stop until every outlet has it. But you haven't started it, Elena said. I was waiting for you. Lucia looked at Elena. Your father built this. He died for it. It should be your hand on the switch. Something moved through Elena's face, not sentiment, something harder than sentiment, the specific weight of a debt that can't be paid but has to be acknowledged. She looked at the server unit. She looked at Lucia. She said, How long does the broadcast take? 18 minutes from initiation to full distribution? And Hargrove's people. As if the word had called them, Ricci's voice came sharp from the top of the stairs. Vehicles on the main road, multiple. They just turned onto the spur. The 18 minutes collapsed into something that felt nothing like 18 minutes. Dante was up the stairs and through the station and outside before the calculation finished in his head, and what he saw on the spur road was worse than he'd estimated. 4 vehicles, not federal sedans but tactical SUVs, moving fast through the snow with their lights killing the dark, and behind them on the main road 2 more sets of headlights holding position. 6 vehicles total, which meant bodies and communications, and the kind of firepower that didn't come with restraint. His follow car had repositioned, blocking the spur road 40 yards back from the station, and his 2 men were out and behind cover and looking at him for direction. Hold the road, Dante said. Do not engage first. Make them stop. He turned back to the station. Ricci, take the door. Nobody through it. How long? 18 minutes. Ricci looked at the 4 approaching vehicles. We don't have 18 minutes. Then we make 18 minutes out of what we have. Inside, Lucia was already at the server unit. Elena stood beside her and Dante came back through the door and said, Start it. Dante, start it now. Whatever happens up here is separate from what happens in this room. Start the broadcast. Lucia looked at him once. Then she turned to the server unit and began the initiation sequence, and a row of indicator lights went from amber to green, one by one. And on the screen above the drives, a progress bar appeared and began to move, and the number in the corner read 1800 and started counting down. The first shot outside was a warning, the sound of it coming through the station walls muffled but unmistakable, and then voices, amplified, the kind of amplification that came from vehicle-mounted speakers, and the words were about federal authority and immediate compliance, and they were directed at Dante's men on the road. Dante went back to the door. His men had not engaged. They were behind cover, and they were holding the line, and the 4 tactical vehicles had stopped 40 yards out, and the doors were open, and figures in tactical gear were deploying into the snow on both sides of the road, using the vehicles as cover, and the amplified voice was still talking about compliance. Then the voice stopped, and a different voice came on. Older. Unhurried. Mr. Viscari. A pause. We both know how this ends. Move away from the building, and we can discuss the parameters of what comes next. Dante recognized the voice from Lucia's description. He had never met Marcus Hargrove in person, but he knew the cadence of men who had operated from positions of institutional safety for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be exposed. He was about to find out. Hargrove, Dante said. His voice carried in the cold air without effort. How many of those agents out there know what you built? How many of them know what they're actually protecting tonight? A pause. They know enough. They know a warrant and a target. They don't know about heliograph. They don't know about the 11 children or Thomas Kane or the 6 families that your operation burned. He kept his voice level. In about 16 minutes, they're going to know all of it. So will the rest of the world. You can move on that building if you want. You can go through my men and through me and through Ricci at that door. But you cannot stop what's already running in that room. A longer pause. Dante watched the tactical figures in the snow. They hadn't moved. You're bluffing, Hargrove said. I'm standing outside a railway station at 4 a.m. in February, Dante said. If I were bluffing, I'd be somewhere warmer. Movement from the vehicles. Not the tactical figures. A door, one of the rear vehicles, opening, and a man getting out who moved differently from the others, who moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had never in his professional life needed to hurry because the architecture of his power meant that outcomes waited for him. Hargrove was tall and wore his age the way certain men wore expensive coats, as evidence of something. He walked forward through the snow without a weapon visible and stopped 20 yards from Dante and looked at him with the practiced assessment of a man who had been evaluating threats for 50 years. You have no idea what you're dismantling, Hargrove said. Tell me. The network you found in those archives, the financial structure, the communication channels, the personnel. It didn't end in 1998. It grew. It has institutional connections across 14 governments. It funds operations that your country's legitimate intelligence services couldn't run on their budgets in a decade. He looked at Dante without apparent emotion. The people who built it are not all criminals. Some of them are the reason certain things haven't happened yet. That argument, Dante said, is the oldest argument people like you make. We are too important to be held accountable. We are too embedded to be removed. The damage of exposure outweighs the damage of what we did. He held the man's gaze. You used children. You burned families. You killed a federal investigator on a Colorado highway and called it an accident. Whatever the network funds, that's what it was built on. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a man who has spent decades not looking directly at something and is now being made to. The young woman inside that building, he said, Elena Kane, you understand what she carries. I know what she carries. Then you understand that it doesn't stop with me. The network is larger than what's on those drives. There are people whose names aren't in any archive who will come for her long after tonight. He paused. I am making you an offer. One time. Walk out of this with the woman and your sister and whatever you can carry, and I stop the warrant and I pull my people back, and tonight becomes something that didn't happen. Dante looked at him. The offer is genuine, Hargrove said. I know it is, Dante said. That's what makes it insulting. He turned back to the station door. You should get back in your vehicle. The next 12 minutes are going to be uncomfortable for you, and I'd rather you watch them from somewhere with a heater. He heard Hargrove say something behind him. One word, clipped, directed at his people. And he was through the station door and pulling it shut when the first tactical figure broke from cover, and the sound of Ricci chambering around at the door was very loud in the confined space, and outside Dante's men answered the movement with the specific professional noise of people who had been waiting to act and were now acting. How long? Dante said, coming down the stairs 2 at a time. Lucia looked at the screen. 9 minutes 40. Hold it together for 9 minutes 40, Dante said, and he was back up the stairs, and the station was no longer quiet. The next 9 minutes were the longest 9 minutes of a life that had contained some long ones. Dante's men held the spur road with the discipline of people who understood exactly what they were protecting and exactly what it would cost to fail. And the tactical figures worked their way forward through the snow on both flanks, with the patience of people who had the numbers and knew it. And Ricci held the station door with the particular physical commitment of a man who has decided that this specific piece of ground is the one he is not moving from. Dante moved between them, door to road, road to door, and took a graze along his left forearm from something in the 5th minute that he didn't stop to look at, and a blow to the ribs in the 7th minute when one of Hargrove's people got through the flanking line and came through the north wall's broken window, and Dante put him down with 2 strikes that left them both breathing hard on the station floor for a moment before Dante got up and the man didn't. The progress bar in the vault below was at 91% when the shooting outside stopped. Not because it was over, because Hargrove had issued an order. Dante heard it through the damaged north wall. One word, hold, in Hargrove's unhurried voice, and understood before he reached the door what it meant. The old man had done the math. His people could take the station. They could not take the station in the time remaining. And a firefight that continued after the broadcast completed served no purpose because the purpose of the firefight had been to prevent the broadcast. In the sudden quiet, the sound of the wind came back. Dante stood at the station door with his left arm burning and his ribs telling him things he didn't want to hear. And he looked out at the tactical figures standing in the snow and Hargrove standing among them. And Hargrove was looking back at him with an expression that was beyond anger, beyond calculation, settled into something that looked like a man watching a building he designed come down. From below, Lucia's voice came up the stairs. Quiet. Steady. It's done. 2 words. Dante felt them move through him the way very simple, true things move. Without drama, without ceremony, with the absolute weight of something that cannot be taken back. He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at him. And somewhere in 14 countries, on server after server after server, the machinery that Thomas Kane had died to build, and Lucia Viscari had spent 22 years preparing, and Elena Kane had carried in a compass around her throat without knowing what she was carrying. That machinery finished its work and went quiet. Hargrove put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at Dante for a long moment with something in his face that wasn't surrender and wasn't defeat, but was the very specific expression of a man who has just watched the last door close. Then he turned and walked back toward his vehicle, and his people stood in the snow, and nobody moved and nobody fired. And the night was very cold and very still, and the mountains held everything in silence. Dante leaned against the door frame with his arm pressed to his ribs and his blood running warm down his wrist, and he looked at the sky above the trees, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like something other than a ceiling. Below him, he could hear Elena asking Lucia a question he couldn't make out, and he could hear Lucia answering, and somewhere in the sound of his sister's voice, still talking, still alive, still precise and relentless, and somewhere in that something that had been wound tight for 22 years began very slowly to release. He had one arm on the doorframe and blood on his coat, and federal vehicles on the road outside, and a senator standing in the snow deciding what a man does when the ground disappears under 50 years of constructed safety. And it wasn't over. He knew it wasn't over. There were names on those drives that belonged to people in 14 countries who had not yet read what was coming and would not, when they read it, go quietly. But the vault was open, and the information was out, and his sister was alive and 40 feet below him. Elena Kane, who had carried a dead man's key around her throat for 28 years without knowing what she was carrying, was breathing in a concrete room that smelled of old paper and truth. Hargrove reached his vehicle and put his hand on the door and stopped. He turned back, just once, and looked at the station and at Dante in the doorway. And what was in his face then was something Dante recognized from men he had watched reach the end of things. Not the rage, not the calculation, but the moment after both of those, when what's left is just the reckoning. Then he got in the vehicle and the door closed and the engine turned over and the convoy on the spur road began to move. and Ricci appeared at Dante's shoulder and looked at the blood on his arm and said, "How bad?" "Not bad," Dante said. "You're lying." "Probably." Dante pushed off the door frame and stood straight and looked at the convoy moving back toward the main road and the dark beyond it. "Get me something to wrap it. We have a lot of work left tonight." Ricci went to find something. Dante stood alone in the doorway of a dead railway station, with the cold coming through the broken north wall and the mountains silent on every side. And from below, the sound of his sister's voice continued, steady and patient and alive, explaining something to the woman who had been a stranger on a highway 72 hours ago and was now the person who had opened the only door that mattered. He didn't go down yet. He stood, and he let himself feel the weight of the night behind him, and the weight of everything that came next, and he breathed the cold air in and out, and he was still standing there when the first gray edge of dawn appeared above the eastern ridge, thin and tentative and nothing like the storms that had been building since the beginning of this, but real. Real enough. The dawn that came over the eastern ridge took its time. It didn't arrive with any drama. No color, no spectacle, just the gradual, reluctant lightening of a sky that had been holding dark for a long time. The mountains emerging from it one ridgeline at a time, like something being slowly remembered. Dante stood in the doorway of the station and watched it, and didn't move until Ricci came back with a field kit and made him sit down on the platform steps and deal with his arm. The graze was clean, deeper than he'd told Ricci, and shallower than it felt. Ricci wrapped it without comment, and Dante watched the light grow and listened to the sounds of the spur road, his men moving, checking, the professional inventory of people taking stock after something violent. And underneath all of it, from below the station floor, the murmur of his sister's voice still going, still patient, explaining things to Elena that had been unexplained for a very long time. He didn't go down until Ricci finished the wrap and handed him a water bottle and said, "She's been talking for 40 minutes. "She has 40 minutes of things to say," Dante said. "She has 22 years of things to say." "Hargrove's convoy is on the main road heading south," one of his men reported from the tree line. "No stops. Moving clean." Dante nodded. He didn't find that comforting. Men like Hargrove did not move clean because they were beaten. They moved clean because they were regrouping, because the tactical calculation had shifted, because 50 years of institutional survival had taught them that the first response to exposure was never the final response. The broadcasts were running. The information was out. But information was not the same as consequence, and consequence required infrastructure, prosecutors, witnesses, chains of custody. And Hargrove had spent his entire career dismantling that kind of infrastructure before it could be pointed at him. What Lucia had built was a detonator. Whether it actually destroyed anything depended on what happened in the next 72 hours. Dante went back inside and down the stairs. The vault room felt different with the server lights all green and the progress bars completed and the battery backup humming its steady note in the corner. Elena was sitting on the floor again. She had a habit of that, he'd noticed, of taking the lowest available position when she was processing something, as if proximity to the ground helped. And Lucia was sitting across from her on an upturned archive box, and they were not talking anymore. They were just sitting in the completed silence of two people who have said the most important things and arrived somewhere on the other side of them. Lucia looked up when Dante came in. She looked at his arm. "How bad?" she said. "Not bad," he said. "He's lying," Ricci said from the stairs. Lucia stood up and crossed the room and looked at the wrap and then looked at his face, and he looked back at her, and they were close enough that he could see the scar at her temple clearly now, and the particular set of her jaw that he recognized because it was the same jaw he shaved around every morning, and the eyes that were their mother's and nobody else's. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it straight." "All right." "Heliograph. The people you recruited, the assets you ran, the operations you built over 22 years. He held her gaze. "How many of them are still in the field?" Lucia didn't look away. 11. All of them loyal to the operation. All of them loyal to the outcome. Which is not the same thing. She paused. 3 of them are embedded in Hargrove's current network. They've been feeding information to the server for the last 18 months. When the broadcast went out, their covers went with it. Are they safe? They're moving. I have extraction routes in place. A pause. 2 of them are in countries where extraction is complicated. Which countries? She told him. He processed the information and the complications that came with it and said, I have people in both of those places. I know you do, she said. That's partly why I needed you in this room tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. You still need things from me. Yes, even now. Dante. Her voice was even and a little tired and completely honest. I have been building this for 22 years alone. I did not build it so I could stop needing things. I built it so the things I needed would be worth asking for. She held his gaze. I need your network for the next 72 hours. I need your people in those 2 countries. I need your contacts in 3 European financial systems to help establish the documentary chains that turn what's on those drives into actual prosecutions. She paused. After that, I need you to dismantle your organization and walk away from it, completely. Because if you don't, everything we expose tonight becomes a story about organized crime producing false evidence against a senator, and Hargrove's people will write that story very effectively. The room was very quiet. You want me to burn down what I built, Dante said. I want you to not let it become the thing that burns everything else down, Lucia said. There's a difference. And you know there's a difference. He did know. He had known it for longer than he'd admitted to himself, the way certain things become known gradually and then all at once. He looked at the archive room around him, the boxes, the drives, the evidence of what his sister had spent her life assembling. And he thought about his organization, the weight of it, the machinery of it, the 30 years of choices compounded into an infrastructure that had protected him and cost other people things he couldn't fully account for. 72 hours, he said. Starting now. He nodded once. Then let's not waste them. What followed was not a resolution so much as a controlled demolition, and like all demolitions, it required precision timing and a willingness to let things fall that you had spent years building. Dante made 11 calls from the station in the first hour. 4 of them were to people who owed him nothing but respect, and answered anyway because in his world, respect was the only currency that didn't inflate. 3 of them were to financial intermediaries in cities he hadn't visited in years. 2 of them were to men in the countries Lucia had named, men who asked no questions because the way he asked the favor told them everything about the stakes. 1 of them was to a federal prosecutor in Denver whose name had come up in the archive files as one of 3 within the system that Hargrove had not yet successfully compromised, and that call was the longest and the most careful, and ended with a silence on the line that meant the prosecutor was doing the same calculation Dante had done 3 hours earlier, the one where you add up what you're being handed and subtract what it will cost you to use it and sit with the number. The 11th call was to his consigliere in Chicago. He told the man to begin the dissolution process, not the public-facing version, not the gradual fade that organizations like his used when they wanted to appear to disappear while remaining intact underneath. The real one, the version that ended things. The man on the other end of that call said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Are you sure?" "Yes," Dante said. "There are people who depend on—" "I know who depends on it. Make sure they're taken care of. Set aside what's needed, the rest goes." He paused. "I'm sure." He ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment and felt the weight of what he'd just set in motion. Not guilt, nothing so clean as guilt, but the specific heaviness of a structure coming down that you built with your hands and have been living inside for 3 decades. It was the right thing. It had probably been the right thing for longer than tonight. That didn't make the feeling lighter. Elena found him sitting on the platform steps in the gray morning light an hour later. She came out of the station with 2 cups of coffee. Lucia had found a camping stove in the supply kit she'd left in the vault, and handed him one and sat beside him on the steps without asking. They drank in silence for a while. The mountains were fully visible now in the pale light, white and enormous and indifferent, and the snow on the spur road had been churned to gray slush by the vehicles and the boots and the night's activity, and in an hour or 2 the sun would come over the eastern ridge, and the temperature would rise 3 degrees, and none of that would change anything that had happened, but it would feel different anyway. "I'm trying to figure out what to do with it," Elena said. "With what?" "With all of it," She held the cup in both hands. My name, my father, what Margaret was protecting, why she ran, what she sacrificed to keep me from knowing things that would have, I don't know, changed something. She looked at the mountains. She gave me a childhood that was actually mine, even if the edges of it were built on things I didn't understand. She gave me a life I chose. The photography, the backcountry work, the apartment in Missoula with the cat. A pause. That was real. That wasn't constructed. No, Dante said. That was yours. But Thomas Kane was my father, and he died for what's on those drives. And I didn't know his name until 3 hours ago. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to be angry at a dead man for decisions he made to protect me, and I don't know how to grieve someone I never knew I had. Dante looked at his coffee. You do it the same way you do everything else, he said. Badly, at first, and then less badly, and eventually you find the shape of it that you can carry. She looked at him sideways. That's not what I expected you to say. What did you expect? Something more strategic. He almost smiled, not quite. I'm having a strategic morning. I needed somewhere to put the rest of it. She nodded. She understood that. He could tell from the way she accepted it without trying to expand it. After a while, she said, What happens to Hargrove? The broadcasts are running. Every outlet that received the documentation has had 3 hours with it. By now, at least some of them have verified enough of the primary sources to begin publishing. He looked at the road. Hargrove is a 73-year-old man who has spent 50 years operating on the assumption that the architecture around him was permanent. The architecture is gone. What happens to him now is what happens to all of them when the architecture goes. They become ordinary people subject to ordinary consequences, and ordinary consequences are slower and messier and less satisfying than anything else. But they are real. Will he go to prison? Some of them will, not all of them. The ones with the deepest institutional connections will find other architectures to hide behind, and that fight will take years, and the people who fight it will not be me. He paused. I won't be in a position to be me after this week, not in the way I have been. Elena looked at him. Your sister asked you to dismantle your organization. Yes. And you said yes. Yes? Why? He thought about that honestly. He thought about the 11 calls he'd just made and the weight of the last one and the shape of what came after. Not a plan exactly, not yet, but the negative space where a plan would eventually be. Because she was right, he said, and because I've known she was right for longer than tonight, and I needed something that cost enough to make the decision real. He looked at the mountains. My organization has kept me alive and free for 30 years. It has also been the reason certain people are not alive and free. I cannot make that accounting balance. I can only stop adding to it. Elena held that without comment. That was one of the things he had come to appreciate about her in the last 4 days. The capacity to receive information without immediately converting it into a response. It was rarer than it sounded. What will you do? She said. I don't know yet. He looked at his coffee, going cold. Something that doesn't require 3 armored SUVs and an encrypted satellite line. He paused. What about you? She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, There are 11 other people from that room, the children in the photograph. Whatever was done to us, the conditioning, the placed memories, the combat training that lives in muscle and not in mind, some of them probably still don't know. Some of them are probably living exactly the lives that were constructed for them and have no idea that anything was constructed. Yes, Dante said. He hadn't said this to her yet, but he had been thinking it since he looked at the photograph in the vault. Someone needs to find them, Elena said. Not to disrupt whatever lives they have, not to run them into burning buildings and railway station vaults. She looked at her hands, the same hands she'd looked at in the snow after she'd put down 2 trained men without knowing how. But to give them the choice, to know or not know. That should be their choice, not someone else's plan. That's a large undertaking, Dante said. I know. It would require resources, contacts, people who know how to find individuals who don't want to be found. She looked at him. He looked at her. I have 3 weeks before I need to be back in Missoula, she said. The Wolfpack assignment runs through March. That's not a lot of time. It's enough to start, she said. And in the way she said it, flat and direct and with a certainty that came from somewhere below calculation, he heard for the first time something that sounded like her father. Inside the station, Lucia appeared in the doorway. She had the satellite phone in her hand and she looked at Dante with an expression he recognized. Not urgency, not alarm, but the focused attention of someone receiving information that changes the shape of the next move. Denver prosecutor, she said. He's moving. He has 3 colleagues he trusts and they've been on the documents for 2 hours. She paused. He wants a meeting, today if possible. Dante stood up. His ribs told him about it and he overruled them. Where? He suggested neutral ground. There's a federal building in Billings. Not Billings. He thought for a moment. Tell him Bozeman. A restaurant, public, lunch hour. I'll send the address. Lucia relayed this and came out onto the platform, and the 3 of them stood in the morning light for a moment. Dante with his wrapped arm and his cold coffee, Lucia with the satellite phone and 22 years of worn patience sitting on her like weather, Elena with her hands in her pockets and her father's compass somewhere against her sternum. The 11 people in the photograph, Dante said to Lucia. You know where they are. Lucia looked at him steadily. Some of them. Elena wants to find the rest. Lucia looked at Elena. Something moved between them. Not warm exactly, not resolved, but acknowledging. The specific acknowledgement of 2 people who have been through the same fire from different angles and are standing in the same morning on the other side of it. I can give you what I have, Lucia said to Elena. Files, locations, the names they were given. What you do with it. She paused. That's yours. I made too many decisions about what was yours without asking you. I won't make another one. Elena nodded once. That was enough. The drive to Bozeman took 2 hours. Dante rode in the back with Lucia, and Elena sat in front with Ricci, and the mountains moved past the windows in the winter light, and nobody talked much because they were all doing the internal work of people who have come through something and are beginning, carefully, to take inventory. Somewhere south of Livingston, Lucia said, I used to think about what I'd say to you when I found you, when I could finally... She stopped, started again. I had speeches. In my head. Very complete. Very explanatory. I don't need a speech, Dante said. I know. That's what I figured out eventually. She looked at her hands in her lap. I just need you to know that not a day of it, not one day of the 22 years, was because I didn't think about coming back. Every plan I built the part where I came back into it. I just couldn't come back until the plan was finished. And the plan is finished, Dante said. The plan is finished. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the window, the Yellowstone River was frozen solid under a skin of snow, and the light on it was the flat winter light that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than seen. Don't disappear again, he said. She said, I won't. And then, after a moment, I'm going to need somewhere to be for a while, somewhere quiet, where I can sleep more than 4 hours without a satellite phone. I know a place in Montana, he said. She almost smiled. The estate. It has a burned east wing and a compromised security perimeter, and at least 3 structural reviews that need to happen before spring. He paused. But it's quiet. That sounds like exactly the right amount of problems, she said. The meeting in Bozeman lasted 3 hours. The prosecutor was a compact, careful man in his early 50s named Arvid Tench, who had the quality of someone who had been waiting for a specific conversation for a very long time and was determined not to waste it now that it was happening. He had 2 colleagues with him who didn't speak much but listened with the attentiveness of people building mental architecture in real time. He had already been on the phone with 2 of the international press contacts who had received the broadcast, and he had, in 3 hours, done more with the documentation than most people would have done in 3 days. He looked at Dante across the table with the clear-eyed assessment of a man who understood exactly what he was sitting across from and had made a specific peace with it for specific reasons. You understand that nothing you've provided tonight immunizes you from existing exposure, Tench said. Yes, Dante said. And you're cooperating regardless. I'm providing documentation of a federal operation that burned 6 families, killed a federal investigator, and used 11 children as long-term intelligence assets. I'm providing it because it's the right thing to do and because my sister spent 22 years building it into something usable. He held the man's gaze. What happens to me afterward is a separate conversation for a separate day. Today, we talk about Hargrove. Tench looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened his folder and said, "Then let's talk about Hargrove." They talked about Hargrove. Senator Marcus Hargrove was taken into federal custody at his Georgetown residence at 6:14 that evening, 17 hours after the broadcast began. Dante learned this from Tench's office via a phone call that came through while he was sitting in the Bozeman restaurant waiting for his second cup of coffee, and he sat with the information for a moment and felt less than he expected to feel. Not because it wasn't significant, but because the significance had been building for so long that the arrival of it was quieter than the anticipation. Lucia was the one who cried. Briefly, privately, turned toward the restaurant window so that only Dante beside her could see it. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on the table near hers and left it there, and she didn't move her hand toward it, but she also didn't move away, and after a while she straightened and picked up her coffee, and they didn't discuss it. Elena heard the news and nodded, once, with the expression of someone receiving a fact they had already incorporated. Then she said, "What about the others? The names on the drives?" "It will take time," Dante said. "Months. Some of them will have protection Hargrove didn't have. Some of them will cooperate when they see which way it's moving. Some of them," he paused, "some of them will find ways to not be found. That's the honest version." "Then it's not over." "Things like this are never over in the way you want them to be," he said. "They're over in the way things actually are, incompletely, unevenly, with parts that work and parts that don't, and a long tail of consequence that takes years to settle." He looked at her. "But Hargrove is in custody. The documentation is in the hands of people who will use it. The 11 people in that photograph have a chance of knowing the truth about themselves." He picked up his coffee. "That's not nothing." "No," Elena said. "It's not nothing." 3 months passed the way the aftermath of hard things passes. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a texture different from ordinary time. Each week a little lighter than the last. The shape of what happened settling gradually into something that could be carried rather than something that had to be dragged. Hargrove's preliminary hearing produced 17 additional arrest warrants across 4 countries. 2 of those arrests happened within the week. The others moved at the pace of international legal cooperation, which was the pace of institution against institution, and Tench called Dante every 3 weeks with updates that were incremental and real, and nothing like the overnight resolution that stories about justice tended to suggest. The 11 people in the photograph were found, one by one, over the course of 10 weeks. Elena found 3 of them herself, using Lucia's files and her own 6 years of knowing how to move through backcountry without leaving tracks. That skill, she had decided, was hers regardless of how it had been put into her, and she used it in service of something that actually felt like hers. Of the 11, 8 chose to know. 2 asked for time and were given it without pressure. 1 refused entirely, and Elena drove away from that conversation understanding why, and didn't second-guess it. The Wolfpack assignment wrapped in March. Elena filed the photographs and wrote the conservation report and drove back to Missoula and opened her apartment door, and the cat was thin and resentful from 10 weeks with the neighbor, and she fed it and sat on the floor with her back against the couch and let it come to her in its own time. The compass necklace was on the kitchen counter. She had taken it off for the first time since childhood, the night after Corvette Pass, and left it there. She'd looked at it every day for 3 months. Some days she picked it up. Some days she just looked. On a Tuesday morning in April, she picked it up and put it back on. Not because she had resolved what it meant, she hadn't, she suspected she never fully would, but because it had belonged to a man she never got to know, who had made a decision that cost him everything, and wearing it was the only thing she had that was close to a conversation with him. She had a meeting that afternoon with a nonprofit legal foundation that Tench had connected her to, one that was building the formal case structure for the 11 children in the photograph. Now adults in their 30s, scattered across the country, trying to build a coherent account of what had been done to them that could function in a legal proceeding. It was slow work. It was the kind of work that didn't have an obvious ending point and would require a kind of sustained attention that was different from anything she'd applied herself to before. She was good at sustained attention. She picked up her camera bag and her keys, and the cat followed her to the door and sat down and watched her with the specific expression of cats who have decided someone belongs to them. "I'll be back tonight," she told it. It blinked. She closed the door. Dante dismantled his organization in stages over 8 weeks, the way you dismantle anything that has been built carefully over decades, by tracing it back to its foundations and deciding which foundations could be repurposed and which ones had to go into the ground. The financial structures that could be legitimately redirected were redirected. The people who could transition to legitimate work were transitioned with what they needed to do it. The rest was let go, and letting it go was not as clean as he'd imagined it would be, and was not as difficult as he'd feared, and the residue it left was something he was going to be sitting with for a long time. He sat with it in the estate, in the study, in the evenings after the work of the day was done. The East Wing was under reconstruction, a project he had decided to oversee personally, which surprised him, and which Lucia, when he told her, said was the least surprising thing she had ever heard. Lucia was in the West Wing. She slept 8 hours a night for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. And she woke up disoriented by it for weeks, and gradually the disorientation shifted into something that felt tentatively like the ordinary sensation of being a person with a body that was cared for, and a place to be and nowhere to be by morning that required a different identity. She was building something new, slowly, without a timeline for the first time in her adult life. She found that timelessness harder than any deadline she had ever operated under, and she told Dante this one evening over dinner. A dinner they had eaten together at the kitchen table, which was still new enough to feel slightly formal. And he said he understood, and the way he said it told her that he did understand, that he was in the same adjustment, that they were both people who had organized their lives around forward motion and were learning, imperfectly, and at the same time, what it meant to be somewhere instead of always moving toward something. "I keep making plans," Lucia said. "I catch myself building structures, contingencies." "Is that bad?" Dante said. "I don't know. Maybe it's just how I think." "Maybe you just need to build things that aren't weapons," he said. She looked at him, then she looked at her plate. "That's not how I would have put it." "I know, that's why I said it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The rehabilitation center. Elena mentioned it." "She did." "Families displaced by organized crime, places to land, resources to rebuild." Lucia turned her wine glass slowly on the table. "I know something about infrastructure, about building systems that hold under pressure. I know something about what it takes to disappear a life, and what it takes to build one back." She looked up. "I'm not sure that's a marketable set of skills in a nonprofit context." "You could find out," Dante said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You think I should?" "I think you spent 22 years working towards something that required you to treat people as variables, including me, including Elena." He picked up his glass. "I think you know that. I think you've known it and you've lived with it because the goal was worth the cost. And I'm not going to tell you it wasn't, because I don't know that it wasn't. But I think whatever you build next has to have people in it as people, not assets, not variables." He paused. "That's what I think." Lucia held her glass and didn't drink from it for a while. Outside the windows, the Montana night was clear for the first time in weeks, and the sky above the mountains was full of stars that had been there all along behind the clouds. And the silence that came in through the glass was the winter silence of high altitude, clean and total, and older than anything either of them had done or would do. "I used to tell myself," she said, "that you were fine, that you'd built something and you were protected and you didn't need me to come back." She turned the glass again. "I told myself that for 22 years. "Were you right?" Dante said. She looked at him directly. "No," she said. "You needed your sister, and I needed my brother. And I told myself that the work was more important than that, and I built a very convincing argument for it, and I'm good at convincing arguments." She set the glass down. "I was wrong about that one." Dante looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "Yes, you were." And then he said nothing more, because there was nothing more required. And they sat in the kitchen of the mountain estate in the April dark, with their dinner going cold and the stars outside, and the specific hard-won silence of two people who have found each other across 22 years of distance and are doing the work, the slow, imperfect human work, of learning what it means to be known again. On a morning in late May, when the snow had finally pulled back to the highest elevations and the lower slopes were showing the first brown edge of coming green, a letter arrived at the estate with no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was precise and unhurried, and Dante stood in the front hall and looked at it before opening it, aware that he was pausing, aware of why. Inside was a single photograph, color, recent by the quality of it, taken in natural light. It showed a woman standing in a mountain landscape, not Montana, somewhere further south by the light and the tree line, and she was looking at the camera directly with an expression that was calm and present and entirely her own. She was wearing a heavy coat and her hair was pulled back, and at the corner of her mouth was the small, involuntary acknowledgement that he had seen once across a desk in a study that no longer looked the way it had. Elena. On the back, in the same careful hand, 4 words and a date 2 months out. The date corresponded to a Wednesday in July. The 4 words said, "The center opens then." Below it, smaller, an address in a valley 2 states south. Dante turned the photograph over and looked at her face in the mountain light, and he felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not resolved, not completed, because the things that had happened to all of them were not the kind of things that resolved into completion, but quieter, resting. The way a compass rests when you stop moving and let it find its direction. He set the photograph on the hall table. He went to find Lucia. The morning light came through the east wing reconstruction, still framed, still open to the sky at one corner where the new roof wasn't fully joined, and lay in rectangles on the floor that were already warm with the approaching season, and somewhere in the distance the first birds of the year were working through their inventory of sounds, testing what had survived the winter. Some things had.